Yeah, success. All right, let's start again. Hi. Mina, I'm here to talk to you about something I've been calling full featured art direction for the web. Hello, that's me. You can find me online at Mina Markham, or that's on Twitter and pretty much any social media. And my website is mina.codes. A brief history of the past couple of jobs I've had. I'm probably most notably associated with 2016, working for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, where I made a design system that powered HillaryClinton.com. But I currently work at Slack, the product that you all know and love. Thank you so much for using it. But I don't actually work on the product. I work on Slack.com, our marketing website. And things like, I mainly do Slack.com, but I also do things that are associated with promoting the Slack product, which also includes SlackHQ.com, which is our official blog. So I do a lot of work around the Slack clients, but not actually on the Slack client. In case y'all didn't see, yesterday we finally officially got dark mode, so yay. It took a little bit of time, but we wanted to get it just right. So I'm happy that that's finally announced and I can actually tell people that. Okay, so before I get too deep into what I'm going to talk about, I do want to take a quick moment to define what I think of when I hear the word art direction. Probably the best definition that I have heard comes from Dan Mall, who's a notable creative director and art director, designer in the industry. And he says that art direction combines art and design to invoke a cultural and emotional reaction. And that part at the end there, the cultural and emotional reaction, that's the part I want to latch on to. So essentially, design is the how and art direction is the why. But ultimately, all of this needs to answer the question, does it feel good? Does it feel good to the end user? And feel good can mean multiple things, and I'll kind of get into what I mean by does it feel good. So essentially, in the purposes of this particular talk, art direction is a progressively enhanced default experience. It is inclusive by design. It is localized by culture, and it's powered by design systems. And I'll get into each one of those pieces here. And so first of all, art direction is progressive. So often we design for the best possible use case, i.e. Ourselves. We assume a desktop retina experience with lightning fast internet. But what I'm suggesting is that we start thinking about the experience that we're using as not like the lowest common denominator, but like the minimum default experience possible in order to achieve our desired result. Rachel Andrew, who is a big advocate for CSS on the web, she had this great Twitter thread where it's more of a rant, as ranty as a British person can get, I expect, but it's a little bit of a rant where she was kind of fed up with people complaining that they couldn't make sites look the same in every browser. She's like, I build sites and applications that work everywhere. They support as many places as possible, but look the same? No, it's not possible. And I would think that this doesn't need to be something that needs to be said and reiterated, but I do deal with a lot of people who file bugs that say it's a site in blah, blah, blah browser doesn't match design or doesn't match the site in XYZ browser. And my response to them is always, the site looking differently in different browsers is a feature. It is not a bug. That's actually how browsers kind of work at this point. They're not going to look exactly the same way. And I kind of want to get us out of that mentality that it has to look the exact same way. No, it has to provide the best experiences possible for that particular tool set. Andy Bell wrote this fantastic article about progressive enhancement and how to do it in the modern design age. And he says that it requires a complete mindset change. And it starts by remembering that you don't build websites for yourself, you build them for others. And so often we kind of get away from that because a lot of times we start designing and building our websites and our products for the stakeholders or for the execs who, if it doesn't look good on their computer, we have to change it. It's like, that's not actually how this is supposed to work. With progressive enhancement, every user should have their own experience at the side rather than the experience that designers and engineers demand and force upon them. Essentially, we need a better default experience. This is probably one of my favorite illustrations of one way to approach progressive enhancement is that to think of it as your end product as a big cake. And the HTML, the content, the structure of that is the actual cake itself. The CSS would be the icing on top of it, or the decorations on top of it, and JavaScript would be like the special toppings and the sprinkles and all the wonderful additives that makes the whole experience much more delightful. Now, there are some people, I don't understand them, but there are some people who actually scrape all the icing and the cherries and things off the cake and just eat that. Like, all they want is just cake. I mean, granted, it probably still tastes good, but it misses all the nice accoutrements that I love, but they're still getting their basic default experience. They still have cake, and those who want all the extra parts of it can still get the cake, that can get a slightly different experience of cake, but it's still ultimately the same kind of cake. So all of this boils down to the need to build with markup first. Now, I like to joke amongst my team that when I get a design like this from our designers or engineers, I actually see designs and wireframes the same way that Neo sees the Matrix. So I'll look at this and be like, oh, okay, I know what's going on here. So this is going to be a header here, a nav there, an anchor tag. Like, I kind of look at them and kind of break them down to their basic semantic elements first, and then build on top of those. So essentially what that site would look like stripped of any of the extra things, just stripped down to its bare HTML elements, it would look like this. It's kind of boring, it doesn't really attract any visual excitement, but people still get the content that they need, which is really the point that I've been trying to get to, that if you strip everything away, the bare minimum should still be there, which means that we shouldn't have experiences that are entirely dependent on JavaScript. And I feel like I shouldn't need to say this because pressman enhancement is not a new topic, but it kind of still, I've discovered that it still becomes a little bit of a problem. When people might say, well, who disabled JavaScript anymore? Like, who would even actually do that? Doesn't necessarily mean that JavaScript is disabled. The point I'm trying to get at, it just means that for whatever reason, you can't always rely on it. You know, sometimes it fails to load. Sometimes there's an add blocker enabled, which is actually blocking JavaScript from rendering. Or sometimes you're just on a really, really slow network. Nothing frustrates me more than when I'm traveling on airplane Wi-Fi or even or hotel Wi-Fi occasionally, and I'm trying to go on Twitter and I'm looking for tweets and they just won't, nothing loads. And part of me is like, this site is basically just a list of text and images. Why can't this work? And I get so frustrated. So what I'm saying is building progressively it means avoiding a bunch of polyfills and fixes necessary for older browsers. If something isn't working, then what you need to do is instead of relying on those more modern practices, you just support a simpler or provide a simpler method. Andy Bell actually does this. The project he was working on that kind of prompted this whole article he wrote is something called mybrowser.fyi. And essentially what this site does is if you go to the website, it'll show you a screen that looks similar to this, that shows you all the capabilities of your browser, whether or not you have cookies enabled or cookies available or JavaScript enabled, things like that. Now this assumes that a lot of more modern web techniques and APIs are actually available in the browser. This is actually the more enhanced experience. If for whatever reason a certain particular API or something he's relying on doesn't work, he provides a less pretty but equivalent experience where instead of getting everything rendered beautifully in a nice design way, you just get this big JSON blob, which isn't great to look at, but it still gives them the exact same information. Now, in the event of some kind of catastrophic failure where I think the JS doesn't render or something, you actually end up getting this experience where it literally is just a button that submits a web form and then will give you back the information that you need. So there's like a tiered experience depending on what capabilities your device actually has. Some of you might be sitting here like, come on, really? Is this still an issue? You know, well, apparently. So I went on at awards. You know that website that awards with like 3 W's, I can't pronounce it properly, but anyway, it gives out awards to like the best and most innovative websites. And so I went on that site and found a couple of websites that they were saying like had one site of the day or something, just to see what these sites actually did. And so I found this one called The History of Web.Design, and essentially it's just a timeline of the history of web design and how far we have come. And so just for fun, just for kicks, I disabled JavaScript in my browser to see what would happen. And what happened was I was greeted with this message saying, we're sorry, but this website does not work properly without JavaScript enabled. Please enable it to continue. Now, I'm not knocking the people who built this website. It's a beautiful website that has lots of beautiful like animations and you kind of move through the timeline to see what's happening. But effectively, again, it's still just a list of text and images. So I feel like there could have been some in between. It works beautifully or it doesn't work at all. So my next thing is that our direction is inclusive. And what I mean by inclusive, I mean we should practice more inclusive design when we are starting to build out our web products. Kat Holmes, who used to work at Microsoft, I actually am blanking on where she works now, but she came up with the concept of inclusive design, and she says that it is a process and not a result. And I think that I have a couple of illustrations to how this idea that inclusive design should be a process versus a result should really ring true. So there was this thing that happened a few years ago where Google Photos started mislabeling images of black people as gorillas because of the algorithm that they had trained apparently didn't really recognize black faces the way that they should be recognized. And I'm not saying that anybody in here had any negative intent. My thing is that if there had been any dark-skinned person involved in the process, either as the engineering process, quality assurance, user testing, at any point, this could have been caught before it reached general public, and it could have saved them a lot of embarrassment and criticism. Similarly, in the physical world, something like this, which I encounter more often than I would like, where sensors just don't recognize a black hand. Like, I don't understand, like my hand somehow just doesn't trigger soap dispenser. Can you imagine standing there with your soapy, wet, with your hands trying to get there and then nothing's happening, so you're sitting there like my hands are dirty from the bathroom and I physically can't clean them? Like, again, if any point in the process had there been a person with as darker skin pigmentation or something, maybe this could have been alleviated. I'm not saying it would be guaranteed, but it could have been. So I first started thinking about this inclusive design process back when I worked for Hillary Clinton's campaign. I worked with a designer named Victor Ng, and he and I developed a very close kind of symbiotic relationship where we sort of fed off of each other. And by doing that, we discovered that we needed to include a bunch of other people in our design process because he and I were only two people really trying to build out this very visible, very prominent site. And so we were talking to a bunch of people who were supporters of ours who had various impairments, either visual, auditory, or motor impairments, to see what their experience of interacting with the campaign site was like. And I did that so that we can build a more accessible experience for those users, but in the process of discovering what their pain points were, we uncovered use cases and pain points that we didn't even consider. So one thing that happened was, out of that process, Victor had this great idea of designing what I believe is the very first Braille campaign buttons. We discovered that supporters with visual impairments or who read Braille or who were blind weren't really able to participate in like the campaign swag the way the majority of the population would, because they couldn't see what the buttons were saying. And so we created these Braille campaign buttons so that they could fully experience exactly what the button was saying, but also still be able to show that to the world as well. So they got an experience that was tailored to them, all the while people who don't read Braille still got the gist of what they were trying to say. Another interesting thing that came out of this was we realized that when you're looking at the logo of the site, which tends to be sort of the big brand ambassador of any particular product or organization you're at, most likely what people do when they show a logo or something on a website, they just say the company name. So that's what we did. We just said Hillary for America 2016 or something like that, which doesn't really convey what the actual visual aspect of it is. So we came up with this idea, or I should say Victor came up with this idea to kind of bring visually impaired people even deeper into that process. And I'll just let you see what the result of it was.
The Hillary for America logo is based on a perfect square grid, 3 squares tall and 3 squares wide. The middle squares are removed from the top and bottom rows, revealing the capital H letter form. An arrow sits across the crossbar of the H, pointing forward.
So the voice that you hear is Michael Beirut. He's actually the logo designer and the sort of the person who created the Hillary for America brand, as it were. And what we had him do was describe the logo as he sees it. So what you would hear if you saw that iteration of the logo is that you would hear the actual designer telling you the process behind how he approached that image. And I honestly think that that experience was a lot better than the default experience that other people got, because normally you just see the logo and that's it. You don't get to actually hear the designer describing what he sees when he sees the logo. So going back to code for a second, one of the big pain points that I've had at most of my jobs is that when I try to enact focus states for any project I'm working on, and usually the response I get back either from my fellow designers or from stakeholders is that they don't like the ugly blue ring that happens when you click on things or when you tap over things. So I end up removing the focus by default because it doesn't necessarily match the aesthetic of the site. It looks ugly. It doesn't look great. David here says that removing the focus outline is like removing a wheelchair ramp from the school because it doesn't fit with an aesthetic, which if you put it out into the real world, it sounds absurd, but that's what a lot of us do on a daily basis, that we remove these very crucial pieces of functionality because we don't like the way that they look or mesh with our brand. And so to that I say, instead of us removing these default helpers, these default things that people with impairments rely on, we should design better versions of them instead. So I tried to do this when I was working on Hillary's site, where part of what I was doing was trying to make the site more accessible to all visitors. And so I added focus states back to the experience when you were tabbing through. And if you can see here where there's this white outline happening on all the text links, I added that sort of, I think it's 2 or 3 pixel thick white outline to all text links, because it made a visual cue for keyboard-only users could just be able to tell where they were when they were navigating towards the site. And it also met the same color contrast specificities for visual impaired users as well. And so I added this to the site without actually really telling anybody I was doing it or why I was doing it. And it worked fine for a few days, but then suddenly one of our higher-ups saw the site and saw that happen for some reason and was like, what is this ugly white outline happening? Can we get rid of this? And so I explained, like, I'm trying to make the site accessible to all visitors, including people who can't use a mouse. It needs to stay. And there's a little bit of a back and forth where we're like, well, okay, but can we just make it less prominent? Like, it's really distracting. And I tried to explain that we need to have it a certain width, a certain thickness, so that people with visual impairments can still see it. And needless to say, I kind of lost the battle. We ended up compromising a bit to what the end state was, where there was this nice white dashed outline happening, which honestly is barely discernible if you look at it right there. But it's still there, so it's better than nothing, but anyone who had any kind of visual impairments and used the keyboard to navigate probably wouldn't have been able to discern what that outline was. So a funny tangent, we were audited by an accessibility firm at some point who wrote a lengthy article about all the presidential candidates' websites. And they said that our site was probably the best in terms of accessibility, with the exception of 2 things, one of which was this focus state. So I'm not a person who says I told you so, but I did get a little bit of a chuckle out of that instance right there. I did something similar when I started working at Slack, where I again designed a default focus state with the thick blue outline. In this instance, I spoke to our designers and our creative director before we started building this, so I could tell them, like, we need a focus state. Can you please design one for me? And they came up with essentially the same thing I came up with a few years ago. So in this instance, this is still there. It still works out pretty well, and it feels more in line with what our visual language of the site actually is. The way I'm doing that is I just have a very high-level generic focus selector that I'm using. I'm adding an outline and an offset so that the outline doesn't touch all the text directly. One pain point I still have is that the focus state activates on tab and on click, so if you're just using a mouse to click, you will see it flash for a second, which is a little annoying, and I keep getting asked to fix it. I can't really fix it without removing the entire focus state, but eventually I will be able to fix it when focus visible becomes fully supported, so I can basically say if I want the focus visible, please look like this. Otherwise, let's just not do anything at all. And now I want to get into probably what my most favorite part of this talk is, which is the part about localization. So about a year or two ago, Slack fully localized in a few different languages. So right now, if you go to slack.com, it looks pretty much like this in the US in English, I should say. But at the bottom, we have this pop-up that shows all the different languages, and specifically all the different countries that we localize our site for. And these are all of the let's see, 3, 7, about 9 different countries that we specifically catered the site to change in. And when we started doing this initially, the list was actually a lot smaller. One of them included Japan. And so we have these abstract representations. Let's see if this will work. Yeah, it does. We have these kind of abstract representations of the Slack client going on there, where people give people just like a little bit of an understanding of what Slack actually represents and what Slack actually is. And so when we first localized the site, we simply translated all the text into the target language, in this case being Japanese. And we thought, okay, this is great. We have a fully localized site in Japanese, and it's working out great. And it wasn't until one of our Japanese interpreters came to us and said, this is actually this is wrong, this is a really bad experience, and we couldn't figure out what she was talking about until she pointed out that showing Western people having a conversation in Japanese is actually a very strange experience for users in Japan who are very used to seeing themselves represented on the screen. So what we realized we were doing we were translating but not fully localizing our experience. We needed to focus on localization and not translation. And what I mean by that was not just taking the raw words and changing them into the language that you need, but actually changing the experience and the visual of the site or the page you're on to make it more suitable and appropriate to the target audience. So in lieu of having actual Japanese models and faces to put on the site, we decided to just remove all the Western-looking faces and replace them with colored blocks that's kind of simulated having a conversation until we could better approach this particular issue. And we did the same thing throughout the site. Anytime we saw a more darker-skinned person who wouldn't be the norm in Japan, we replaced it with someone who looked more appropriate to that regional audience. And so that included all of our illustrations, that included pretty much any photography that wasn't about a specific customer itself. So fast forward about a year and a half or so, and we now do have fully localized UIs that feature regionally appropriate names and faces. So the way we do that is we do that through something that we've started to call personas. So if you actually look on slack.com, you'll see my face a lot because I'm one of the personas that is represented on the site. So persona A is my face with one particular name, but that persona also becomes different faces and names depending on where you happen to be looking at the site itself. So in the US in English, persona A is my face with the name Zoe Maxwell. So you'll see that name kind of permeated throughout the US. Anywhere we reference persona A. But if you were to go look at the same site in Brazil, you would still see my face, but the name would be changed to something that's more regionally appropriate to the Portuguese language. Similarly, if you go to Germany, suddenly my face becomes someone different and a different name because the local teams we talked to, they told us which faces and names would make the most sense to the users in that particular region. So in Germany, my face becomes something different and my name becomes something different. Similarly, when we are in India, I become an Indian woman with a different name attached to it. Same thing with Japan, it's now a Japanese woman with a Japanese name attached to it. So these little tricks here, these little tweaks make the Slack site feel more relevant and more appropriate to people who are looking at them in those specific countries, which makes them feel like the Slack product is actually more targeted towards them and built more for them. I mentioned before that we were doing lots of string translation, which of course we still do. And a lot of the requests that I would get back from our translation team would be requesting for more context. I get this note a lot where, can you give me context for what this word means? Can you give me context for what this particular phrase means? Because they want to, our translators are trying to make sure that they are accurately representing what the actual voice and tone in the field should be. Anka here, our localization manager, she wrote an article that says that the witty remarks that we make and the reference to a culturally appropriate familiar idiom, those kind of things are extra thoughtful about because they build trust with the global users. The end goal is to make it so that no matter where you're viewing Slack, no matter where you're using a product in the world, it feels like it originated in their country. Essentially, for our localization team, context truly is everything. So when I started thinking about how much care and love is taken into making sure that our words that we use are more culturally appropriate, I started thinking about how can we apply this to the rest of the experience. So I looked at a bunch of global companies and global brands to see how they approach localizing their products or their sites. So Apple kind of does the approach that we did at the beginning, where they just replace the text and images with more culturally relevant images. So Coca-Cola, again, another big global brand. This is, I believe, their global default site, but if you switch it to Hong Kong, for example, you see a completely different experience, not even replacing images here. It's actually a completely different website that I believe is built by a completely different team. So looking at the Coca-Cola site, I started thinking about, okay, well, that is such a drastic change from what Coca-Cola has done in other regions. I wonder if there's a reason for that being so different in Hong Kong, or in China, I should say. So I started looking at more Chinese and Japanese and Asian marketed sites to see if that was something that if I could figure out what made more sense for that particular market. So here's a few examples of some top sites I saw when I was just randomly Googling around for these kind of sites. And so I was noticing that a lot of them had lots of dense text. Some of them, like the one I showed you before, had more bright colors and very bright and very bright and bold. Some of them had a lot more compact spacing with all of the characters there. This one even more so, much more compact spacing. And as I was looking at all of these sites, I remember thinking, why do they all look so bad? And I felt terrible thinking that, and I feel terrible saying it now, but when I said that, I started thinking, that's a really arrogant and egocentric thing for me to say, because there's a reason that these sites look this way and behave this way in these regions, without trying to speak on behalf of all Japanese or Chinese or Asian designers. I did a little bit of reading, and I realized that because the characters are much more compact, they actually don't require as much white space, which is what we tend to associate with good design, quote unquote good design. So my friend Amelie actually has a great word, a great term for what this sort of inner turmoil I went through. She calls it the hegemon design gaze. And the hegemon design gaze basically dictates what we think is good or bad design, and it's often from a very Western, very Eurocentric point of view, and it's sort of the fault of, with little regard to the utility or the origin or the environment in which design is actually viewed in. So essentially what I was practicing is I was looking at all of these sites that originated in Asian countries and Eastern countries and looking at them from my very Western-centric point of view and deciding that they were bad because I didn't understand them, which is not what good design and good UX is actually about. We should be tailoring it more towards what the target audience will respond to. My friend Ying Liu is actually really good at doing this. She was recruited a few years ago by Disney to create a campaign for the Disney Shanghai resort that was opening to encourage citizens of Shanghai to actually apply to work for the Disney resort. So she was asked to take some very iconic Disney characters and figure out a way to make them appeal to Chinese users, Chinese visitors. So of course she took Mickey, Snow White, and Elsa, some very iconic Disney characters, and tried to figure out some way to make them still look very much like Disney, still be authentically Disney, but also make them uniquely Chinese in a way that would attract and speak directly to that target audience. So what she decided to do was she went to a traditional Japanese paper cut style and decided to apply that to these iconic Disney characters. So Japanese paper cut, Chinese, that's very terrible of me. Chinese paper cut style looks pretty much like this, where it's very beautiful, these very intricate details cut into these paper designs that Chinese users would be very aware of, and it means something very distinct to them. And she decided to apply those to the Disney drawings to kind of to blend the two worlds, so to speak. And the result was this, which was a very successful campaign and was able to they were able to use this to completely fully staff the Shanghai Disney Resort, which was great. It was kind of all over Shanghai, just promoting people coming to work for the Disney Resort, which was really cool. Okay, so what she says here is that the target market's local customs should be recognized, respected, and infused into the design. I tried to do this with my own kind of very rudimentary knowledge of Japanese design and Japanese culture with a blog post that we had on the slackhq.com site. So I took that article and I started looking at some examples of Japanese print design because I wanted to get a feel for what this design looked like. And I started seeing this motif of the big red circle, which is on the Japanese flag, and it represents the rising sun in Japan. So just going really quickly through the code and how I did this, I used the lang attribute to target Japan specifically so I can change the visuals only for the Japanese language. I changed the font family for that particular language so that it had a better representation of Japanese characters. And then I used CSS Grid and writing mode to kind of switch around the layout a bit to see what I can do differently for this particular instance. I did a couple of things. I changed the way the body text and the hero image related to each other. That's what this code snippets here are doing. But essentially at the end of it, it looked like this, where I had this bitreg circle in the background. I changed the writing mode of the headline to be vertical, and I offset all the body copy to be a little bit more to the right, which looked all right, but that image right there, that big image there, kind of clashed with that red circle there. So I was like, let me figure out how to fix that. So I went ahead and made that grayscale and used blend modes to darken it a bit. So now it looked like that, which looked a lot better and very distinctive and feels more in line with those examples of Japanese design that I was looking at. So the end result looked like that, which not anything too great and too astounding, but I just wanted to kind of see what I can do on a localized level for one particular blog post. So I still wasn't done. I wanted to have a little bit more fun. I wanted to sprinkle a little bit of fun on top of it. So I ended up making the circle animate to kind of simulate a beating heart, which is completely unnecessary, but I wanted to have some fun. And the way I did that real quick was keeping in tune with the inclusive by design sentiment that I went towards before and progressive enhanced experience. I only have that animation happen if, for one, the supports reduced motion, if that preference is supported at all, and then only if you don't have it turned off. So really, you would only a few small percentage of people would actually see the animation because it's hidden by a flag, and then it's hidden. Then you have to actually say specifically that you don't want to turn it off. But I thought it was a fun little way to kind of add like a little cherry on top of this experience. So lastly, what I need to cover pretty quickly is our direction is systematic. So a design system is so many different things to so many different people. It is components, it's voice and tone, it's principles, it's colors, it's documentation. It's all of these things and more. But really, for me, a design system is, at its core, just a set of rules. And the best part about that is that rules can be broken when you need to break them. So I think that we have a tendency to focus a little too clearly on, this is a diagram of like all the different pieces of design systems and how they relate to each other. But I think there's this hyper-focus on components. mostly because most of the conversation in design systems happens in correlation with product design and not editorial design. But when thinking about localization, when I was thinking about localization and localizing our experiences, I started thinking, is it possible to localize, to have a visual language powered by a design system for each language or each locale? An example I found of this in the wild, or the closest I can get, was the Public Theater, which is in New York City. Public Theater creative director, Paula Shear, she's running this, the creative director of this theater for like 20 years. And she had this problem where she had an identity of this theater and the identity of the individual plays that were running by that theater every single year. And she felt like if she made everything look the same, it got boring year after year. So here's an example of pretty much everything kind of looking very similar, which could get repetitive after a while. But if she changed it for every individual play, the theater as a whole would lose its identity. So a couple examples of like every show looking very different, you kind of lose the fact that these are all by the same theater company. And that sounds very familiar to me because it's a lot of the tension I hear about design systems where we focus so much on consistency and keeping everything the same that you lose the element of creativity. But if we go against the point of a system and make everything different, then you kind of lose the point of having a system in the first place. And so the way that she solved it was she took the color system and typography set and she translated that into a seasonal standards manual, which meant that essentially the public theater got a new identity every single year. So I applied that particular idea to design systems where I say, okay, well, instead of having a new can we have a new visual language for every locale versus every year what the public theater did? And so I wanted to see if I can like translate what she was doing into a more like standards, something that would look similar to design systems leaders out there. So here is an example of 1 year of the public theater's, 1 year of the public theater's like different approach to their visual language. If I were to translate that into a design system documentation, you could see, okay, imagery looks like this with the black and white and the halftone, and then the color system's there with the typography and the different angles that the typography is set at. Similarly, for a different year, here's the different year where it's kind of similar but still pretty different. The color palette's different. The types, I'm pretty sure the typeface is the same, but it's just angled differently. And so that would be kind of looking like this for a manual for that particular year. So if I applied these two, instead of these being per year, in my mind, those can be for different languages. Like the pink could be for one particular language or country set, and the yellow could be for another language and country set. So it's still an idea that's a work in progress. The next steps will be for me to figure out how I could scale this so that you're not literally creating multiple conditionals in one style sheet or something like that. So it's still a work in progress, but it's an idea that I've been playing around with more and more to see what can come to fruition there. And so I'm out of time now, but I just want to give a little recap of the way I've been defining art direction in terms of this talk. And it is progressively enhanced default experiences. It is inclusive by default. They are localized by culture, which I think is the key there, and they are powered by design systems. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm available for questions later if you have any.